So far, we haven't discussed the situation in respect of the people who lived on the islands, which to any person coming new to this discussion would seem to me to be a pretty central consideration, not least because of the fact that in this extraordinary period of decolonisation, which was barely 30 years, when the whole of what was the British Empire involved the granting of independence to no end of countries, the cardinal principle was the wishes of the people who are there. It was, we only gave independence because people wanted to be independent, and with the, I suppose, as the exception of Hong Kong, which we all know is a different excuse me, situation. But my sorry, as you can probably tell, I've got a cold. The question, I suppose the factual question first of all, is how many people are there who could sensibly claim to be inhabitants of the island before they were expelled? And that would have to include their descendants now. It's so long since then. So just a numerical answer to that. And secondly, how much do we know about their views about the decisions of being that are currently being made about them and their homeland, if I can describe it in that way?
In terms of numbers, I think there were, and the numbers are a little bit sketchy in terms of the original decision, but I think there were 1,000, 1,500 that were ultimately removed from the archipelago. Possibly 300 to 400 of those survive today, and then several thousand of second and third generation Chagossians. So probably thinking in those terms. I mean, I think the tragedy of what happened back in the 1960s was that, unfortunately, in terms of international law, and again Jamie can say a little bit more, is that the Chagossians do not have a voice. So it's the decision regarding the breakup of the territory just prior to independence being achieved, which is the most important international legal question. If that separation hadn't taken place, the Chagossians would have been part of an independent Mauritius now. So that's the sort of the nub and rub of this question, unfortunately, in terms of international law. And of course, the power which Jamie alluded to earlier of the British government to use orders in council to originally remove the population has been tested a number of times in the British courts, and ultimately on all occasions the Chagossians have lost those cases. So the sort of the legal and historical set of events is unfortunately not in the Chagossians' favour. Now, of course, there's a moral argument here, absolutely, and then part of what is in the treaty and what will be discussed with the potential handover will be key. So I think, again, for the committee to look at maybe not so much the response of the Chagossians to what is being suggested, but in terms of how they will be treated, how they will be supported going forward, will be most important.
Yes.
We're at the boundaries, those awkward boundaries between legality and morality, aren't we, at this point? But we earlier had a discussion about to what extent these Indian Ocean territories are different from other overseas territories, and it shouts at me that the key difference is that pretty well everywhere else the wishes of the inhabitants, massively so obviously and demonstrably so in the Falklands and in Gibraltar, has sort of trumped everything else, which I think we can all understand and probably and support. But here, it's difficult to say what a neutral observer would feel, but it seems to me that almost anyone looking at this would say that the views of the people who lived there and live there now should be a very significant factor in any decision that's reached. So I suppose I just repeat the question I asked before. What do we know about the views of the people and their descendants who were, I would say, sort of shockingly expelled from where they lived?
I think I'll just address some of the legal aspects of this because I think they're important. So the Chagossians have been treated shamefully by the UK's own admission. But the people with the right to self-determination, so the people, the entity with the right to determine the future status of the territory, is defined by reference to the whole of the territory. So on that understanding, the Chagossians are part of the people of Mauritius in a formal legal sense. Now, the position in international law then is highly unsatisfactory as far as the Chagossians are concerned, because they are not, in a moral sense, I think, it's not justified to talk about them as a mere subset of the people of Mauritius. They've been treated despicably. Part of the reason they've been treated despicably is that the pre-independence Mauritian government cooked up a deal with the UK, albeit with a gun to its head, proverbially speaking. But so the Chagossians, even though they may not have the right to decide the future sovereignty of the territory, they do have a right, in my view, to be consulted in a meaningful way. And I think this right goes beyond a moral right, actually. I think as the indigenous population of the territory, they have a right to be consulted about the use of the land and maritime spaces of the territory. And this was, in fact, the basis for a claim that was brought by a group of Seychellois Chagossians in the international, when they tried to intervene before the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea in the Mauritius-Maldives maritime delimitation. And I acted for them in that case, and the whole nub of their case was, we are not a mere subset of the people of Mauritius. We have distinct rights, and we need to have those rights taken seriously. And one thing that the Chagossians in the UK have complained about in particular is the tokenistic way in which they've been consulted in relation to this whole agreement. And I don't know the full details of the consultation process, but it does seem to me that perhaps they have a legitimate grievance in the sense that they should have been involved in a richer, more meaningful way throughout.
I think we've got a couple of supplementary. Sorry.
I'm still going on about the question, do we have any idea at all amongst the people that we've been talking about what their preference would be in terms of sovereignty?
There are different groups. They have splintered, the Chagossians have splintered into a few groups with different opinions about what should happen to the territory. And some of them don't want a deal to happen at all. Some of them were fully behind the Mauritian efforts and even went to the ICJ with the Mauritian delegation and gave evidence saying how they supported the return of sovereignty to Mauritius. So they're not speaking with a unified voice, and I don't really feel capable of giving a fair representation of the proportions of Chagossians who support the deal or not. I'm just not sure.
The fact is that the question hasn't been asked democratically.
It hasn't been asked democratically, and a democratic asking of that question would then raise the question of who should legitimately be consulted. Clearly the group who are called the natif, as they call themselves, the people who were actually physically expelled from there, how many of their descendants should be consulted as part of such a process?
All right, we've got quite a lot of supplementary questions. Trish, do you want to have a start?
Just wanted to clarify. So the Chagossians weren't stateless, they became full citizens of Mauritius, is that right?
Well, so some Chagossians were displaced to Mauritius, some were displaced to the Seychelles, some were displaced to Crawley, and because it's near Gatwick Airport. I'm not sure how many of them are Mauritian citizens, but I know that a number of them are not, including some of the Seychellois.
So they are stateless, or what would their passports say?
Some of them have British passports, some have Mauritian passports. I don't know whether any are strictly stateless.
I don't think so, but certainly scattered and adopting the nationality of where they were placed originally.
Nick, do you want to...
Thank you, Lord Chairman. I just wanted to clarify something you said. Surely they are guaranteed. Are there not very strict UN rules about the stateless people?
About stateless, yeah, but I can't say, as a matter of fact, whether any of the Chagossians, or the number of whom may not be citizens of a state. I just don't have that information.
No, we can't.
But has the UN expressed a view on this?
I don't think they have specifically related to the Chagossians. It is about the issue of sovereignty.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. And they do have sovereign rights.
No, they don't.
Exactly. No. Right. Okay.
Christy.
Yes, in our briefing, we were told that the Chagossians continue to experience chronic impoverishment in Mauritius, and they've largely remained at the bottom of the Mauritian society since their arrival on the island. Would you expect the treaty to have anything in it that would strengthen the rights, economic rights, of Chagossians in Mauritius?
Ultimately, it is a sovereign decision for Mauritius, but I think that's a key element of the potential financial package which might come with the treaty, in terms of the level of support, in addition to what they have received in the past, they might receive going forward. That's probably the extent, unfortunately, of my answer.
Yeah. If I recall correctly, there was something in the communique about supporting Chagossians and assisting with their right to visit the islands and possibly with resettlement. But I agree with Peter, this is ultimately something for the detail of the treaty.
Can I ask a practical question? Sorry, just on that. It's an archipelago, there's a big base on it. What's the sort of distances? Americans have said we don't want any people anywhere near us. But is there a practical agreement that could allow some part of the archipelago to be resettled without compromising America's security? In other words, are they just being precious as opposed to be genuinely concerned about security?
I think that is actually an issue. That the outer islands, and not including Diego Garcia, I expect will be that they will allow a resettlement and they will allow Chagossians to visit, which they cannot currently do.
And I think that's an important change in terms of how things have been perceived, so between the 1960s and today. So I think the general attitude, and also the attitude of the United States, has changed in that regard. Of course, there's the issue of economic viability, and there were questions around that in the 1960s as well, but that maybe is another issue.